Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome to Dime's webinar series. We will get started promptly, although I'm aware that people will be coming in the coming minutes. I am particularly excited about today's session as we're focused on Dime's Library of Digital Endpoints, which recently had its 4th birthday. So it's a really nice opportunity to bring everyone together to review what we've learned from the library over the recent years and also discuss future directions. So thank you for joining. My name is Jessie Backer. I am VP of Digital Measures and Diagnostics here at Dime. I'm joined today by Mario Aguiar, a health tech correspondent from Stat News, who'll be moderating our session, as well as Rachel Chassie, Brad Hirsch, and Chris Leptak. I'm going to take the first few minutes to give a bit of an overview. Then I'll hand over to Mario, who will moderate the sessions. And at the beginning of that piece, He'll take us through some introductions, so you'll hear a lot more about my co-panelists there. But first, a bit of housekeeping. As I'm sure you saw when you joined the meeting, today's session is being recorded. No transcription, please. The slides and the recording will be made available on Dime's webinar page after the session. Later today, we will move after the panel discussion into a town hall style. So please do add your questions for discussion into the Zoom chat box. We'll take those during the live Q&A. And let's get started. So by way of background, the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, is a global nonprofit organization dedicated to the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and improve lives. We launched in May of 2019 to be really the home for professionals in the field of digital medicine. So we sit at the intersection of healthcare and technology. And right away, Dime recognized soon after launch the need for a central, openly accessible database of digital endpoints in industry clinical trials. So only 3 months after Dime was launched, the first iteration of the Library of Digital Endpoints went live. So the library serves many purposes, but primarily it allows the community to learn about what digital measures are being used in what kinds of clinical trials and in what ways. The fact that it is constantly maintained and updated also allows us to track trends in the industry over time. So now's probably a very good time to quickly define digital endpoints. We're focused here specifically on clinical trial endpoints collected using sensor-based digital health technologies. So when the library first launched, and you can see this stat opinion piece here on the screen, the library contained 34 digital endpoints in clinical trials from 12 industry sponsors. And as of our most recent update on the 4th birthday, which I'll walk through in more detail in a moment, we've identified 63 industry sponsors collecting 405 digital endpoints in 98 clinical trials. So that is a 12-fold increase in digital endpoints in industry trials in only a 4-year period. So enormous growth over a very short time. So here are some high-level, here we go. Here are some high-level observations. Firstly, let's take a look at the pie chart in the middle. Almost 70% of the endpoints. Sorry, can I just ask everyone to go on mute? Thank you so much. Okay, so the pie chart in the middle, almost 70% of endpoints are in drug development. And that's actually an increase from around 50% in the first iteration. And about a quarter are in medical device trials. Smaller numbers in behavioral, biologic, genetic, and combination product trials. On the left-hand side, we can see that the majority of endpoints are in phase 1, 2, 3. And of the phase 3 trials specifically, it's not shown on the slide, but we have 66 primary and secondary endpoints. In addition, we have 31% of the trials in the library don't have a phase because they're not drug trials. Presumably, a good proportion of those are also pivotal trials, and there are an additional 94 endpoints there. So what I'm getting at here is that it's really heartening to see that there has been an elevation of endpoints, digital endpoints, into primary and secondary positions. The library, of course, allows us to look at how those numbers and distributions have changed over time. And with that in mind, the library in its most recent iteration has gone through some substantial improvements in the latest launch, which went live yesterday. So firstly, we have additional data fields and improved filters. So the 4 variables shown above the line, those are related specifically to the endpoints. The endpoint description and the position, so primary, secondary, or other exploratory, as always. But in the recent upgrade, we have carefully and systematically mapped all of those endpoints to a health concept. And we've also standardized the technology type categories. Below the line are the variables related to the trials themselves. So as always, we have the trial phase, but we also now have the primary purpose of the trial being screening, diagnostic, treatment, or prevention. We have the condition of interest. Again, that has now been systematically categorized according to the International Classification of Diseases maintained by the World Health Organization. We have the trial intervention, both the actual description as submitted by the sponsor, but also the categories, drug, device, biologic, etc. Some demographic information, and finally the industry funder and the link to the trial registration record. So there is now more data available in the library, and it's in a more searchable, kind of easily accessible format. So another new resource which went live yesterday is the downloadable methods document, and that gives a detailed description of how the library is maintained by DIME, as well as the crowdsourced updates, in addition to the eligibility criteria. So to be eligible for the library, an endpoint must be listed on a trial registration record, including but not limited to clinicaltrials.gov. The trial must have 1 or more industry sponsors and/or collaborators. It must be interventional, and specifically, it needs to assess a regulated product. And of course, the endpoint itself must be digital. And we're looking at endpoints evaluating the safety or effectiveness, efficacy of a regulated product, meaning that analytical validation studies, for example, of the technology themselves are out of scope. In terms of how the endpoints are identified, the team at DIME completes a search of clinicaltrials.gov quarterly, but really importantly, there's a crowdsourcing element. So the website, which you can access right now, contains a link to a form where anyone, there's no paywall, can submit an endpoint that they believe is eligible. And that whole process has now been streamlined as well. And finally, there's also a button online that allows you to request a copy of the data set as a downloadable CSV file. So the last thing I will show you before we begin our discussion, here is a very zoomed out view of the library that you'll see when you access it online. I'm not expecting you to be able to read all this, but the endpoints are initially grouped by trial. You can regroup, reorder, filter in any way you like. And each of those colored bubbles that you can see in the various columns are standardized categories which are filterable and sortable. So it's now even easier for users to track trends and find what they're looking for. So that's my whirlwind tour of the library as it stands today and some of the recent updates we've made. I am now going to hand over to Mario from Stat News, who has followed the library since it's launched, and allow him to introduce our co-panelists. We will then move to a town hall style. So please do enter your questions, but we'd also love to hear, when we reach that point, your stories of how you've used the library and how it's impacted your own work. So Mario, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jesse. And I'm afraid that you're giving me a little more credit than I deserve. I have not been following the library for that long. I joined Stat News about 3 years ago, which is my first foray into the world of healthcare after covering technology for a decade before that. But this is a fascinating area for us. For those of you who don't know, Stat is the health and science publication owned by the Boston Globe. And I'm part of the team that covers not biotech or COVID-19, but digital health technologies and big tech in healthcare. And we write about these topics all the time, and you can read about it, all the latest studies and and other updates in our health tech newsletter, which runs twice a week and is absolutely free. And Jesse already covered this, but before we dive into introductions, we will take your questions about digital endpoints, the future. We want to know what you want to know, not what I want to know, which is interesting to me, but maybe not to you. And of course, at the end, we will have an opportunity for people to share their experiences using DIME's resources. So with that, I will ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and how exactly their roles or lives intersect with digital endpoints. And I'll begin just based on who I'm staring at right now with Chris.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate DIME for the opportunity to participate in today's virtual discussion. By way of background, I work for Greenleaf Health, which is a pharmaceutical consulting group based in the DC metro area. Prior to that, I was at the FDA for 14 years. And around the digital measures space, I previously was the director for the biomarker qualification program, which is the development of novel endpoints for clinical trials for regulatory use. We realized very early on that of the tools that were being used, there certainly was a creative enterprise out there looking at new ways to do clinical trials and to gather information that's meaningful to patients. And certainly the digital approaches in that space has just completely blossomed, as was pointed out, with the first iteration of this particular resource now growing 12-fold within a very short period of time. I just wanted to do a shout out to DIME for putting forward such a public resource. The FDA has been doing something analogous around surrogate endpoints. And I know since I was in charge of leading that effort, how much of a resource intensive effort it is to gather the information, to curate it, to update it, et cetera. So the community is very much indebted to DIME for taking on that. And the resource itself, from my point of view, as working with my clients, whether they be small biotech or large pharma, many of them are now wanting to introduce these novel endpoints into their clinical trials, both in early and late stage development. And the resource being publicly available and crowdsourced and curated is certainly a place that the sponsors can go to look to see who else is doing what in their space. And if nothing else, I think people are being encouraged that this is something that the FDA is in fact open to, and that has grown the interest as well. There was some concern early on of how FDA would look at this, but I think that they can now have the confidence that FDA is certainly supportive of these efforts, and that's evidenced just by the number that are being studied. Very much looking forward to today's discussion.
Rachel, why don't you go next?
Hi, sure. Hi, everyone. I am Rachel Chassie, currently a digital operations lead at AbbVie. Prior to my current role, I was the founding director of innovation at DIME. And one of my very first activities I did at DIME was actually the creation of this library. And it's been incredible just to watch it blossom. In my current role at AbbVie, I focus on the operations side of the shop. So working on how do we make these great ideas actually happen, right? Because you can't get a great idea can't blossom if you can't get it off the ground. And also continually changing hearts and minds, letting folks know that digital innovation and digital medicine is something that is doable, and it's not just hokum. So I think we can definitely see that with the growth of the field and as witnessed by the library, especially. That's what makes me here today.
Brad, please let us know about you.
Thanks for the opportunity to take part today. So Brad Hirsch, I'm a cancer doc and investigator by background, but now lead product and implementation across all of our products here at Verily, which is Google Alphabet's life sciences group. And have a somewhat different perspective. Have not been as involved in the development of the library itself, but spent a lot of time thinking both on the hardware side as well as the biomarker side of how do we develop novel biomarkers, novel insights, how do we apply those to trials, how do we support pharma and others that want to do that work, as well as the payers and patients and others on the other side. And so really excited to be a part of this discussion, and DIME, for Verily, for myself, for others, has been a fantastic partner over the course of years now. And so I think this is incredibly important work, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
So as I mentioned earlier, I was a tech reporter in the beginning, and I want to talk about the future eventually. But I think, to begin, we got an overview of what digital endpoints are in the beginning from Jesse. But Chris, I wondered if maybe you could spell out for us some definitions here. Digital endpoint, digital biomarker, digital measure. These can be conflated. They can be the same. Help us out here, and why all these distinctions matter.
Well, the distinctions matter depending on who your audience is. And so certainly with my background at the FDA takes a kind of very rigorous view of the definitions and classification, primarily because that defines who is going to be on a review team for the expertise that will be working with the sponsor. For some other communities, maybe it's less important, but certainly some of the terms are used synonymously. From the agency's perspective, the digital is kind of an adjective, if you will, where it's the way that the information is being collected. Just because you're modifying it doesn't make it kind of a standalone. So in general, from a regulator's point of view, you'd like to have sort of foundational principles that are there irrespective of the sort of novelty of the ideas that are coming forward. So to your point, digital biomarkers, digital measures, digital health technologies, all of these can kind of get jumbled together. But in general, if you're talking about endpoints, which is the focus of this particular public resource, endpoints from a regulator's perspective has a very defined definition around clinical trial design and the packages that come forward to the agency for product approval. And so the digital piece to this, is Candace nicely laid out at the beginning, at least for today's discussions, it's the collection of data through sensors. There's other ways that digital can be applied just with decentralized clinical trials, where you could gather patient information through digital diaries on patients' smartphones, et cetera. That's not the focus for today. So it is important, and it doesn't mean that one set of definitions is right or wrong. It just helps to have a conversation where people are using the terms with the same intended meaning so that you can have productive conversations.
Thank you for that. And I guess we are here to discuss the library a little bit, and we got an overview of how far we've come. Rachel, I understand you were there in the beginning, and I wondered if maybe you would fill us in on a little bit of the I don't know, sometimes in journalism we call this gossip, but what's the backstory? What's the story behind the story here a little bit?
Sure, always happy to talk about gossip, Mario. Thanks for that. So the start of the library was something, well, it's also entwined with the origin story of DIME. DIME was started with folks who were, the early adopters to the space, who were trying to really make this happen. And having DIME starting in 2019, the year means more the further we get away, because it was never a reaction to the pandemic. I think a lot of folks were working with digital because we were all kind of forced to live in this virtual world. But a lot of us were not the people who were kind of forced to do it. We were talking amongst ourselves saying, how can we work together to have a common language, right? We just talked about how important that is. How can we also work and bring other people along with us? So part of the reason for creating the library was to really show that using these endpoints was something that was already happening in the field with players who were, some of the heavy hitters. We hear a lot of folks saying, oh, well, why are we even looking at that? That's something that'll happen a long way. No one's actually taking it seriously. It's not being used, etc. Well, we were the people working in the field, and we knew that was wrong. And how are we going to show that was wrong? Well, we're scientists. We're going to show our work inside our sources. So we created the library to show who is working in this field now, to show that it's not just the future, but it is the now. I see Gustav's great question here in the chat, right? Where the first question is, well, why do you include interventional trials? From the very beginning, it was important to include interventional trials. So the conversation isn't just, folks aren't only using it for exploratory reasons, right? We're not just playing around with these measures, but we're actually using it in meaningful ways. We really want to do meaningful investigation. And that's what elevated from including, why we excluded exploratory and included interventional. And so we can see there that not only putting forward this library to show folks that this is what we're using now, people are using it. We wanted to tap into a little bit of FOMO that can exist in this space by saying a lot of your competitors are using this too. Do you want to be left behind? Do you want to tell your leaders that you're being left behind and you don't have a digital team? And also to show folks, well, how is it actually being used, right? In real ways, with citing the different studies that are using it. You can see endpoint designation. I'm always interested to see the amount of studies that are primary and secondary, for example. Those are the ones that I think are really interesting. So we included this library to show folks that this is not something that is just folks kind of toiling away in their basement, kind of tinkering away with hobbies, but this is the future. And these are real things that are happening now, creating really interesting ways to show value for patients.
And Jesse, earlier you gave us a nice overview of everything that has happened since, and we've seen obviously an enormous growth of the library, and a lot more people participating. I guess tell me what it means, right? Like all of the slides that you just showed us before. Like, what does it mean about how far this has come until now?
Yeah, thanks, Mario. I'll focus on something quite practical first. And as someone involved in the latest update to the library, I'll just describe something that I think is probably not as obvious to external audiences. And that is that the quality of the reporting in the trial registration records has improved enormously. I'm sure Rachel can attest to this, being involved in the early days, but early on, it was much harder to identify digital endpoints in clinical trials, and there were a lot of judgment calls. We still have to make some, but more so back in the day, as to whether a particular endpoint was digital, how is it captured, what is the tool. But our common terminology and language has just come so far in a short time, and the information that sponsors and investigators are now putting into their trial registration records describes the endpoints with greater clarity, and that makes our job certainly a lot more straightforward, but it helps us all, and it really fulfills one of the other objectives of the library, which is to try to avoid duplicative efforts. So if we don't all need to be reinventing the wheel at every individual sponsor, if we can go to one central location and understand what's happening within the space that we're interested in, it's just hugely beneficial for moving everything along.
Thank you. And so I want to talk about potential benefits here a little bit, and I'm going to go first to Rachel, and I have a follow-up after that for Brad. But Rachel, put on your AbbVie hat here for a second and explain to me and our audience, what are the benefits of using these endpoints? Like, why, for those who have not yet bought in, are thinking about doing that, why should you do that?
Sure, Mario. I'll try and wear two hats, an AbbVie hat, and then also perhaps a hat that's more patient focused. So a lot of the ways that I think if you don't, the early part of my career was working directly with patients and measuring and in the dementia care space, right? And so how is dementia measured? Well, you can't really diagnose dementia until post-mortem, but we got to do that in the real world. So ways that we're doing it were, I was fresh out of college at the time, psychometrician, doing these kinds of tests. I did my best, but perhaps, people like me can't be as sensitive to every kind of nuance about a patient's life, right? And so there are ways there are gold standard measurements from different health conditions that really aren't terribly precise. Some of the gold standard measurements still include a tape measure and a marker to mark someone's spine on their body, physically mark on their body. That's not terribly precise. As a patient, I would feel perhaps I want something a little bit more specific, a little bit more scientific to help me kind of feel better, right? Whenever we sometimes have to just kind of look at something and then just eyeball it and give our best judgment. I want to give our clinicians a lot more. They're a lot more precise than that. I know that Brad's here too, as someone who is an actual doctor and does a lot of great work working with patients. But sometimes the best we can do is really just kind of eyeball something. That's just, science is hard. But with the use of technologies, we can actually go in and measure things with precision, with specific ways for either individual for each patient. We can now measure people remotely in the home as opposed to only measuring them once a year in a clinic. The way that we can use technology, I feel, is one that is exciting from on a humanistic level. We can study patients at home in a more specific way and a lot more time points than just that once at the clinic. Technology allows us to do that in a place where we had never have before. And so whenever we think about how do we measure these things that really matter, really help patients, or in ways that, some patient populations have been languishing because there hasn't been a lot of innovation, technology allows us to do that. So whenever we're here at AbbVie thinking of, looking into our different spaces, how can we measure things well? Well, we think about what's been done before and how can we make things better. The library can be really useful because a lot of us are working in the same kind of field. So we can see, well, I don't know, we're kind of measuring the same kind of stuff here. How are our partners doing this in a unique way? What actual technology are they using? Am I looking at this product or this product? Well, Pfizer is using this. So let's see how that's useful or maybe how it's not. The library has been really helpful from that standpoint too, and then really also just the use of technology from especially from a pharmaceutical standpoint really is endless.
Mario, can I add on to something Rachel had touched on around the patient's perspective? One of the benefits of the digital measures, when clinical trials are conducted, they're done at clinical trial sites. Those trial sites are usually in urban areas where you don't get the patient diversity that you get where a patient can be at home, to Rachel's point. And one of the challenges that FDA has had for many years is trying to diversify the population that are involved in clinical trials so that ultimately physicians can have more confidence that when a drug is approved, it will be beneficial more broadly rather than just the white males that tend to be studied in the trials. And so with the advent of digital measures, there's an opportunity to increase the diversity because people aren't being tied to a brick and mortar clinical trial site. While that may still be a component of the trial, the fact that at least the meaningful piece to the patients, the endpoint, can be done in a home setting really increases the opportunities for patients more broadly.
Thanks for that, Chris. I like to add on top of that too by saying that digital is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all of our problems too. It just looks at problems in a different, more nuanced way. And so while Chris is absolutely right, this allows us the ability to penetrate folks' homes in ways that are meaningful, but we also need to think about how technology does create sort of a chasm of access sometimes, right? If we require folks to only have the most, whatever iPhone 48, whatever version we're on now, a lot of folks don't really have that. So whenever we're using technology in a way that's really mindful to access patient groups that have been historically left behind, we can't just think putting a smartphone in their hands is actually going to solve it. We need to be really mindful and really thoughtful about how to do this. And the best way is to co-design studies along with patients to let us know what's useful, what's not, what can work and what can't. But if we do it right, we can do it just the way that Chris says, to access a lot more different kinds of folks who have been historically left behind by the healthcare system.
Brad, I know that that's something that you all think quite a bit about in terms of expanding the pool of people who can potentially participate here. Wonder if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, specifically on the sort of, we recently stood up at Verily, our health center, our Center for Health Equity, led by Vendel Washington. And we spent a lot of time, and we have a very large user experience in other teams. I think that there are a couple of key points of how to actually expand it. One is, it's not only how we deploy it and how we empower people in the home, it's also how do we define the devices, how do we define the digital endpoints. And so despite, we are a large organization, we have about 1,500 people, about 100 of those people are actually user experience folks. And so when we're doing large projects, we're doing one with L'Oreal right now, interestingly, of how do we engage diverse populations. And so you have to think about it very early. And I worry that if it's at the point of deploying, then it's too late. That'd be my first comment. And I think that's really important as you look through the endpoints that are being delivered and developed. The second point is, we have to have, these trials also have to be run, and the validation of these trials have to be run in diverse settings to begin with, because the patients aren't going to come into the academic medical centers. And so one of the things that, they come in, but not at the same scale and don't get engaged in the same way. And so one of the things we're really working hard on is that a lot of the trials that are validating everything we do, the devices, the endpoints, the drugs, you name it, that those are happening in community clinics and community centers. And so, for instance, in oncology, some of our best partners are some of the very large oncology clinics and health systems that have really diverse populations, faith-based organizations, others that allow us to actually be with the clinicians and the clinics and diverse populations up front, which then empowers them to be a part of these trials, to be validated accordingly, our user experience team to work with them. And so I think it has to be sort of end to end to be successful.
Brett, I also, wanted to ask you about sort of one of the things about making trials or evidence collection better is making it more efficient. And I to build on Rachel's comments earlier, I thought maybe you could, that's some of what you all are working on as well.
Yeah, so we think an incredible amount. To run one of these trials, it's like any other part of pharma. It doesn't just cost as much as some of the novel drugs and other things that folks do, but it's still incredibly complex to stand up a new trial, engage the sites, enroll the patients, get to the other side, analyze the data. And when you look, these aren't funded like the Pfizers and others for many of the groups trying to develop these devices and endpoints, although more and more, they are done in partnership. And so we have to have a framework where this work can be done at scale with lower, not everything, just like the comment here, the part of the point of the library is everything shouldn't be de novo. We should look across the 400 plus folks that have already done this work. We should learn from them. And it shouldn't be me as an investigator or a pharmaceutical client or somebody like that have to do it from scratch, right? And that's a lot of the point of the library. Similarly here, we need to build a reusable infrastructure to do this work. Verily, it's one of our huge area of interest. Oncology, we're building prospective registries where we partner with health systems, where we can send individuals, we have baseline data being collected, we bring together third-party data sets, we build that infrastructure that then folks can hopefully use. And we have some specific examples in the digital endpoint space where it's not us developing the device, it's not us even necessarily developing the endpoint, it's us developing the infrastructure that then folks could come in and use in potentially a pre-competitive space to say, hey, test your device, we'll help you get the endpoints, we'll help to validate with the FDA, we'll work with Dime, we'll do all that work to really drive efficiency, because I think that'll have an enormous impact on the ability to develop these measures when it's not us saying, hey, we have a study watch, we want to study it in Parkinson's, we're going to have to go find 400 patients and do a whole series of projects over the course of years. And so I think there's enormous opportunity in sort of how to drive efficiency and scale within that process.
Thank you. Jesse, I wanted to ask you a question that's come in from the audience here, and I think it's a relevant one, which is, is FDA approval of the sensor device a prerequisite for the digital endpoint in the library? And explain why that question is relevant.
Yep. It's a question we get a lot in various different ways. So quick answer is no. The endpoints are eligible as long as they meet those criteria we went through earlier. Really importantly, the FDA draft guidance has clarified that for collection of data in a clinical trial, the technology does not need to be a regulated medical device. It can be consumer-facing technology, which the FDA refers to as general wellness. So no, we are dealing with digital health technologies across the full spectrum, and that's really important. And I think it comes back to some of the other topics that have come up in terms of frameworks and development and things, because the technologies really varied. We talk a lot about wearables, but there's also implantable sensors, and ingestible sensors, different safety standards, etc. So huge variety of technologies, and no need for FDA clearance or approval or granting or whatever it happens to be.
Can I add to that?
Of course.
So I completely agree with Jesse in that you don't have to have an FDA cleared or approved device. That said, if it's something that's on the market, like a smartwatch or something along those lines that's out there for folks to basically monitor their health based on their own curiosities. If it's used in a clinical trial setting, the FDA does query that technology to see to what extent it's performing in a way that gives reliable results if they're ultimately going to be used for a product approval. And so they will look at the performance characteristics of the device, et cetera. So I just didn't want folks to think that just because it's out there on the market, of course you can use it for a regulatory purpose, because many times that's not the case.
No, thank you for that. And actually, I was going to switch here a little. One thing that maybe the devices don't need regulatory approval, the drugs absolutely do. And so we need I'm curious, Chris, if you could spell out for us the regulatory landscape right now, like where are these devices now, and kind of what needs to happen to move it forward? I know that earlier this year we saw a drug trial with a primary endpoint that was a digital measure. Digital primary endpoint. See, here I am mixing up my terminology, but it did not succeed. I think a lot of people hold that as a standard or a bar they would like to see hit, a milestone. But where are we in terms of how regulators are approaching this stuff right now? What's the state of play?
Well, one thing I think it's important to learn from the quote non-successes, much like the scientific literature doesn't like to publish negative results. Negative doesn't mean everything as part of that program was therefore not useful. So just because a drug study doesn't achieve its intended objectives and it can't be used to support a product approval, doesn't mean that the components of that trial were incorrect. And so you kind of need to take a clinical trial and break it into its components. It may be that the drug just wasn't efficacious, but that the digital endpoint was just great, but the drug just didn't work. So don't take failures as being sort of a blanket that everything as part of that trial failed. So that's just kind of a general comment. I would say around the digital endpoints, one of the things that I work with clients that want to bring forward these ideas to the agency is that there's folks that are really excited by the novelty of the technology in and of itself, and kind of want to bring that forward regardless of whether or not it's needed. So in general, if someone wants to bring forward a digital endpoint in a trial, I think one of the things that the agency looks very carefully at is what is the value that the digital component is bringing to the table. Ultimately, it's convincing the agency that you need a better mousetrap. And don't overcomplicate things. If there's something simple out there that's been tried and true, and drugs have been approved by it, and the digital is only going to basically give you the same results, but in a more complicated way, probably not the best use case. But if there are examples where the digital collection of data, especially because it can be continuous or measured more frequently, that gives a much better sense to the agency of what is the trajectory of that patient in the clinical trial. Rather than doing just a baseline and an assessment after so many months, you can actually see interim measures to see if there's a positive trend. And those kind of things can be very convincing when you're putting forward your arguments to the agency around the drug approval.
Chris, you just spelled out a number of ways that industry can be a little more, or can communicate sort of the reason for these endpoints better to FDA. I guess I'm curious, Rachel, maybe what can FDA do to communicate better about what they need, or what resources could FDA perhaps make available that it's not, in terms of making this it's smoothing along the transition to this technology, which a lot of people really believe in?
Sure. So I think there are things that people are asking for, and sometimes those requests are valid, and sometimes they're kind of not. I think a lot of different folks are just waiting for regulators to just spell things out so easily and just take that and go. That's not really how regulators work, right? Regulators would love to see really interesting things come to them, and if they have something so tightly prescriptive, that's going to stifle innovation, right? So for regulators to be a little bit more clear about kind of ways in which people can be really innovative, but also be really clear on what types of things they probably wouldn't take. I think Chris was really had some good input there by saying they like to see interesting things, but also it has to be kind of useful. So for regulators to be more useful for folks in industry and other developers is to really tell us a bit more. Let me take a step back here. I think people are asking, they want to know exactly, well, the regulators will and won't accept that. And people like to say, before they can move forward with an innovation, they'll say, oh, well, the regulators won't ever accept this, so let's not even try. I find that to be not really useful thinking. If you can put something useful in front of the regulators and put up a good case, they will listen. But you have to also be willing to accept that kind of feedback. So now I think the question that you posed, Mario, was what can the regulators do to make things really useful? I like to flip that question and say they're pretty useful now. But I think what prevents people from moving forward is that they have the idea in their head that applications are so risky, they don't want to move forward, they want to see someone else go forward, maybe pass or fail and learn from them, but they're a little bit too afraid to do it. I recommend folks to talk with your regulators, do it early, do it often, and then you'll be a bit more successful. I think kind of being a little bit too afraid of regulators kind of puts people not really communicating with them, but I'd like to change that narrative and say, talk with them early and often.
Don't fear your regulator, I think is the message there. Jesse, did you want to add
Yeah,
something?
thank you. I would just love to build on that comment a little bit more. If we, thinking of the FDA as our example, the Digital Health Center of Excellence has published their framework, there's draft guidance coming out, and FDA representatives have been collaborating with us in the field since well before DIME was launched. So also, more recently within, for example, DATAcc, that DIME hosts our collaborative community with CDRH. So, with all of those examples and everything coming out, I don't see regulators as a bottleneck. I think they've been really active and collaborating and as Rachel said, kind of learning with the field so that it's not just a, top-down prescription. But I guess if I can point to one, a possible area of advancement, I do think some streamlining of the qualification pathways would be a really big step. And maybe even, one day thinking about pathways, beyond what we already have. So, hypothetically, even like, let's think of a new pathway similar to a de novo or a 510K that focuses specifically on measurement. So a pathway to market rather than a pathway to qualification as such. Things like that I think would be fantastic developments.
We have a doctor in the room, and I wanted to ask, what's the potential here for things for digital endpoints, to the technology that's being developed, any of the resources that's being put into that to find its way into care outside the context of drug development? Like I feel like Verily is trying to connect some of those dots in what they're doing, and I'm curious, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, always dangerous to be the only doctor on a panel. So first, we spend a lot of time with exactly that. If you look at the strategy that Verily has leaned into here in 2023, it's the overlap between research and care, and how do those actually become deeply intertwined, as well as what we call our Numetra portfolio, which is our device and biomarker portfolio, and how do they complement both ideally. Things like our Study Watch are specifically intended to complement both our research and our care, and look at how do you flip back and forth and actually drive things forward. Examples today of things that we're talking about, our Parkinson's work, the goal there is to look at that to drive drug discovery, but also to then flip that into how do you actually optimize care? How do you look at it? Because it is very relevant to the average individual. We published something in Nature Digital Medicine last year in 2022, looking at a composite measure of bradykinesia, tremor, and gait. And obviously that's a great endpoint of, is a drug working, but it's also a great endpoint of what does that mean in day-to-day practice for an individual. One of the other projects we've been involved in with DIME is around what's called cytokine release syndrome, which is we have all these new drugs in oncology and used elsewhere too that use the immune system to fight your disease. In the process of that, people can have very severe reactions. And so often, new drug called the bispecific that's largely only given in hospital settings or in high acuity settings. And of course, your average person wants to get their cancer care near their home. They don't want to have to drive to an academic center or a large hospital. And yet, when I was talking to one of the leaders in one of the big health systems that focused on this area, he was saying, like, I tell them to go onto Amazon and buy a blood pressure cuff and a thermometer and sort of figure it out, which clearly is not safe, is not appropriate, right, in a lot of different directions. And so these are things that are important endpoints of how trials are designed, but also really important with how do we deliver care differently. So I think there are, in the nocturnal itch work that DIME did, I mean, there's a whole list of areas that are, in my view, just as applicable to the development side as they are to the clinical care side.
And Chris, I did not mean to deny you your bona fides. You are also a doctor, so I apologize for that. I cannot believe it, but we're running out of time here, and we have so many unanswered questions. But I did want to, sort of pose one, and each member of our panel can briefly answer one or both of these, which is one: what is a coming milestone that you're looking for, something that you want to see, and what are we going to be celebrating as the state of the industry in 8 years? When we're at DIME's 8th anniversary. So answer one or both of those, and then we've got to move on to the town hall. But Chris, why don't we start with you?
So I guess as part of the 8th anniversary for the public resource, much like what you've seen today, not only is it growing in numbers, it's growing in value. You're now, based on what Jesse had shared, they're looking at more metadata around those elements, including the indication, the primary endpoint, et cetera. That just makes the overall resource more robust. What I would like to see, and not that DIME could do this necessarily with this, is more granularity around the measurement method. If you're kind of pulling information from clinicaltrials.gov, et cetera, it's very kind of high level and summary form. That doesn't give you the how-to or the nuts and bolts of the sensor and some of the challenges that they've had. So to the extent, because this has a crowdsourcing component, I'd hope that the pharma sponsors in the biotech industry that are using these digital endpoints in their trials, perhaps to think about how this could be more of a pre-competitive space to share those learnings, so that it could be ultimately a way that the information could rise all the boats, so that each individual company is not trying to kind of deal with the same set of challenges, because they are, and we see that with our clients. So to the extent that there could be something that could be more public facing, that would be really helpful.
Great. Rachel?
Sure. One of the things, well, perhaps the biggest thing that gets you the most excited in this digital medicine space, and that's why I have really honed in my career, really focused in this, is what this can do for the future for patients who have been historically left behind, patients who look, I think, different than some people who have been historically had access to care. How can technology, we find ourselves to be in a place where we are in a revolution of healthcare, which maybe that's too big of a phrase. That's how I see it, right? We get to drive this revolution. What do we want to see? I personally want to see healthcare being more accessible to more people, different backgrounds, socioeconomic status, everything else too that gets mentioned. And I think technology can do that. So what I want to see, and whenever we have our big, 8-year kind of looking back, is really seeing these technologies have value to patient groups who have been historically left behind. How are we helping these patients with technology in unique ways, co-developing these products with them, and being sure that we've Brad mentioned having patients along from the very beginning. I want to see all those kinds of success stories, because that to me is what's important. Not, innovating and helping the same kinds of patients, but rather the ones who have been left behind. That's what I want to see, and that's what I think the promise of technology gives us now, that we've been missing in healthcare. That's what I want to see in the future. What gets me excited are those that I see, right? We hear about cool technology for how it can be used, which is great, but I'm interested in what patients are asking for. I get excited whenever we hear about patients come to their doctor and say, well, I brought this technology in. That's interesting. Lets us know that patients are using this. So those are the ones that I want to see. How are we actually helping patients and hearing from their own words what they want to see and how we can help them, and actualizing that? And I think that creates value for everyone on the panel and from every place in which we sit.
Brad, and Jesse, that means you get the last word, but Brad.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think it's an extension. Mine is an extension of what others have said. I don't think that the endpoints we're developing, the digital biomarkers, the metrics we're developing, are really that the goal is to stop at the clinical trial. The goal is to then have those things be useful enough to the patient and the payer and everybody else that it becomes a part of care, because we're better able to optimize dosing, we're able to understand who's getting worse in the clinic. And so for me, it is, and it gets back to sort of a research and care overlap at Verily. It is really, how do we develop these measures, get people excited about them, and therefore they have to be in Parkinson's and cytokine release syndrome and itch and other things, that then really translate so that we're actually driving equitable care at scale, but we're also driving better outcomes with all this work that we're doing, because we can get better insights. And to Rachel's point, it's not somebody coming in with a Fitbit and showing me their actigraphy data and me saying, I don't know what to do with that. And is 10,000 steps the right number for health and wellness in the world, right? But we're actually moving the needle on things. And so I think it's still a long road, but I absolutely think it's on the right path.
Okay. So I mentioned endpoint qualification before, and I'm going to come back to that. I would love to see qualified digital endpoints, certainly coming out the end of that process, but also more and more entering the funnel. I don't think we're certainly not seeing enough even beginning the process. And the way that we're going to get there and advance through those steps is through multi-stakeholder collaboration. In fact, I think that's really the only way. The Nocturnal Scratch project has come up a couple of times. The V3 framework, our work ongoing in sleep, physical activity, and ADRD. These are all examples with really great uptake. of work that has been done by multiple stakeholder perspectives in the pre-competitive space. So I am actually really confident that we'll see much more of that in the next 4 years, and hopefully that will translate into more and more qualified endpoints.
Some very inspiring insights there, and I'd like to thank all the panelists. We're supposed to move on now to the town hall portion. There are some unanswered questions, so if there's any space in there, the DIME staff can maybe address a few of those, which I think are more on the, you know, are very important, but like nuts and bolts kinds of questions that are very good for you all. And thanks to all the panelists and to DIME for the opportunity. And I'll hand off the reins here. So thank you all.
Wonderful. I will open us up then. Does anyone have something they would like to share about how they have relied on the endpoint library data? We would love to hear how it's actually impacting everyone's work. No one likes going first. All right, in that case, let's come back to some of the questions in the chat.
Okay, Jesse, can I take one? I know you're moderating, but
Rachel, go for it.
I'm in the middle of typing furiously, and if I could just answer verbally, I can probably pay attention here. So C1CO has a question about how are folks actually, how are organizations and companies including and listening to patient perceptions and experiences of digital technology and addressing barriers? Thank you for that fantastic question. I probably should have asked you to ask that in person. So if you want to go off mute and add any additional color to that question, do feel free. But I like to respond. So I need to start by saying I'm not on the patient integration team at AbbVie, right? So I'm not answering as AbbVie. But in order for this to actually happen, one, it's the only way to actually make things that are useful for patients, right? I can think that I know what a patient needs, but I'm not a patient and I'm not a community of patients, so I couldn't ever actually truly know as much as I think I do know. The only way for this to be useful is to bring patients along from the very beginning and talk with them frequently. But if we're asking what a company can do, well, first of all, to make anything longstanding at a company, you need two things: a real budget, not pennies and just assume that patient integration work is just something that will happen for free because it's feel-good work. It needs budget, and it also needs a useful runway of time to make things work. You can't go ask a patient once, or a patient team once, get that feedback once and say, oh, well, it didn't work, so we're not going to have this be really useful, right? If you do something time and money, that's the only way to make this all succeed. And if teams don't build that, then they don't really care about patient perspectives, quite truly. If you don't have a team who really talks to patients about this, then I don't see how that team or that company can really be patient focused.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Dan Webster.
Yeah, thanks so much. I wanted to go back to that question of like, how do we use the digital endpoint library? Because I think that's an important one. And I'm talking about this, not unlike Rachel, from the AbbVie perspective or a pharma perspective, where it's extremely useful. And I would say the graphics are very sharp and they're very nice to bring people on board about where the state of the field is at a glance. There's so many nice resources. I would make a call out to the regulatory class as well that's offered through DIME, where a lot of people are asking, like, what's the state of the field? What are regulators going to think? Screenshot that stuff, use it in your slide decks. I mean, it's such a useful resource. It's a place to go. So unabashed recommendation there. And thank you guys for making it available.
Dan, love comments like that. Thank you so much. No, it really does help to hear that kind of feedback and hear how people are using our resources. I'm not seeing any further hands up. I'm going to take one more question from the chat and then move into some announcements, if that's okay with our audience and panelists. So one question here: are there human and operational factors of devices or sensors and their use that influence the collected data quality documented in the library? I think this is kind of a similar question to what we addressed earlier around regulated versus non-regulated products. The usability, the human-centered design, the human factors of the products does not have a bearing on whether they are eligible for the library, although it does have a huge bearing on the fact that they are in the clinical trials to begin with. And so instead, much like with the regulatory question, it's really about just kind of looking at the evidence of usability and the way the product has been designed, the co-design processes, all of which really feeds into the quality of the product and ultimately, has a bearing on the success of the trial. We are getting to the end of our time here. So I'm just going to bring up my screen once more. I have a few announcements and then we'll end by thanking everyone. So first of all, please stay tuned for our upcoming publication. We have been working with the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, looking at quantifying the benefits, costs, net present value, and REI associated with using digital endpoints in clinical trials. So some really fascinating insights coming out soon. If anyone is interested in learning more about our next project, very relevant to everything we've been discussing today, please do access this site. We will be looking at developing a business case to support the development, adoption, and scale of digital endpoints. So you'll learn more about that here, and you'll also be able to share your interest in joining us. Finally, this is the best way to really hear about everything that DIME is up to, both currently and in future, and learning about the projects that we've wrapped up, including things like that Tufts analysis that I just mentioned. So please do take a quick scan of the code. We'll disseminate this later as well, and sign up for whichever communication efforts suit you. We really take our communication efforts with the community really seriously. So please do take advantage of that. Last thing I'll mention before I go off screen and start making some thanks is that our virtual journal club is coming up reasonably soon. It's weird to say 2024, but January 18th. So we'll be looking then at incorporating digitally derived endpoints within clinical development programs by leveraging prior work. And you can see we have a really impressive panel there. So with that, I'm going to come back onto the screen here. Thank you so much. I mentioned up front that I was so excited for this webinar because we hold the endpoints library near and dear. So thank you, Mario, Rachel, Brad, Chris. It was wonderful to chat with you all. We've learned a lot. We've also got some really fantastic questions from the chat. So we'll be going through those and making sure that we address those individually as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again at our next event.